At 12, my parents dumped me in foster care to travel with my sister. Now they're jobless, desperate, and reaching out. So I gave them what they deserved. I, 29M, never thought I'd be writing this, but after what happened last week, I need to get this off my chest. My parents abandoned me when I was 12, and now they want back into my life. Here's how I handled it. The day my world collapsed started like any other Tuesday. I came home from school expecting the usual chaos of my little sister running around while Mom made dinner. Instead, I found them sitting at the kitchen table with serious faces and 3 suitcases by the door. Dad cleared his throat and explained they were moving across the country. My sister had been accepted into some prestigious dance academy, and this was her big chance. They'd found a foster family for me because, as Mom put it, they couldn't afford to support both of us during this transition. I'd join them once they got settled, they promised. Maybe in a year or 2. I remember standing there, backpack still on my shoulders, trying to process that my parents were essentially trading me for my sister's dreams. The foster family was nice enough, they assured me. I'd be fine. That was 17 years ago. The promised reunion never came. The Hendersons were decent people who took me in, but I always felt like a temporary guest in their home. I threw myself into school, sports, anything to avoid thinking about the family that left me behind. I graduated valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to engineering school, and built a career in tech that most people would envy. My sister became a moderately successful dancer, touring with various companies for about 8 years before injuries forced her to retire. My parents followed her around like devoted roadies, funding her career with money they didn't have. I knew this because I'd occasionally check their social media, watching from a distance as they celebrated her achievements while never once mentioning the son they'd left behind. Last month, everything changed. I was working late when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Mom, explaining they'd found me through LinkedIn. Dad had lost his job 6 months ago. They were facing eviction, and my sister was struggling to find work after her dance career ended. They were desperate and wondered if we could reconnect. The message was carefully crafted, full of regret and explanations about how hard it had been for them too. They'd wanted to reach out sooner, but didn't know how. They were proud of what I'd accomplished and hoped we could be a family again. I stared at that message for hours. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, to forgive everything and help them. But a larger part remembered the 12-year-old boy who'd cried himself to sleep in a stranger's house, wondering what he'd done wrong. I decided to meet them. We arranged to have coffee at a place downtown. I arrived early and watched through the window as they approached. Dad looked older, grayer, with the defeated posture of someone who'd given up. Mom seemed smaller somehow, wearing clothes that had seen better days. My sister walked between them, still graceful but with the brittle confidence of someone whose dreams had crumbled. The reunion was awkward. They peppered me with questions about my life, my job, my apartment. Mom kept touching my arm and commenting on how handsome I'd become. Dad wanted to know about my salary, my investments, whether I owned property. My sister mostly stayed quiet, occasionally mentioning her dance career in past tense. They eventually got to the point. Dad had been unemployed for months, and their savings were gone. They were behind on rent and facing eviction within weeks. My sister was applying for teaching positions, but hadn't found anything yet. They needed help, just temporarily, until they got back on their feet. I listened to their pitch with the same expression I used in business meetings when vendors were trying to oversell me on products I didn't need. When they finished, I told them I'd think about it and get back to them. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson had always been kind to me, treating me more like family than my actual family ever had. I told her about the meeting and asked for advice. She listened patiently before sharing something that changed my perspective entirely. She'd stayed in touch with social services after I aged out of the system, and she knew things about my case that I'd never learned. My parents hadn't just abandoned me for financial reasons. They'd specifically requested that I not be told their forwarding address because they wanted a clean break to focus on my sister's career. They'd actively prevented me from contacting them. Armed with this information, I made my decision. I called my parents and told them I wanted to help. I'd found them a solution to their housing problem and would cover all the expenses. They were overjoyed, crying with relief and gratitude. I arranged for them to move into a beautiful apartment across town. The lease was in my name, and I paid the first month's rent and security deposit. I even hired movers to help them relocate their belongings. They couldn't stop thanking me, promising this was temporary and they'd pay me back as soon as possible. What they didn't know was that I'd specifically chosen an apartment in the same complex where the Hendersons lived. I'd also had a long conversation with the building management about the lease terms. The apartment was gorgeous, much nicer than anywhere they'd lived in years. Floor-to-ceiling windows, modern appliances, a view of the city skyline. They moved in on a Saturday, and I helped them get settled. Mom made dinner that night, and we sat around their new dining table like the family we'd never really been. On Sunday, I told them I had a surprise. I'd arranged for them to meet some neighbors who were excited to welcome them to the building. I knocked on the Hendersons' door and introduced my parents to the people who'd raised me when they couldn't be bothered. The look on my parents' faces when Mrs. Henderson hugged me and called me her son was worth everything. Mr. Henderson shook Dad's hand and mentioned how proud they were of the man I'd become, despite the challenges I'd faced as a child. They talked about my graduation, my first job, the holidays I'd spent with their family when I had nowhere else to go. My parents stood there realizing that strangers had been more of a family to me than they'd ever been. The conversation grew increasingly uncomfortable as the Hendersons innocently shared stories about my teenage years, my college applications, the times I called them crying because I felt so alone. After we left the Hendersons' apartment, my family was quiet. Mom tried to explain again why they'd made the choices they had, but her words sounded hollow even to her. Dad mentioned that they'd always planned to bring me to live with them once things stabilized, but he couldn't meet my eyes when he said it. I let them settle into their new life for exactly 1 week. On the following Sunday, I knocked on their door with an envelope. Inside was their eviction notice. The lease I'd signed was month to month, and I was terminating it effective immediately. They had 30 days to vacate. Dad demanded to know what was happening. I explained that I'd given them exactly what they'd given me, a temporary living situation with people who didn't really want them there, followed by abandonment when it became inconvenient. Mom started crying, asking how I could do this to family. I reminded her that she'd asked herself the same question 17 years ago and decided that family was negotiable when it conflicted with other priorities. My sister finally spoke up, accusing me of being cruel and vindictive. I agreed with her assessment. I told her I'd learned from the best teachers, parents who'd shown me that love was conditional and family was disposable when it served your interests. They begged me to reconsider, promising they'd make up for lost time and be the family I deserved. I told them they'd had 17 years to make that choice and had consistently chosen not to. This wasn't about money or housing. It was about consequences. I left them in that beautiful apartment, surrounded by the temporary comfort I'd provided, knowing they'd have to face the same uncertainty and abandonment I'd experienced as a child. The difference was that they were adults with options, while I'd been a 12-year-old boy with none. Update 1. The 30 days passed quickly. My parents tried calling me repeatedly, but I'd blocked their numbers after our final conversation. They reached out through social media, email, even tried contacting my workplace. Each message was more desperate than the last, alternating between apologies and accusations. Mrs. Henderson called to tell me they'd moved out on the last possible day. She'd watched from her window as they loaded their belongings into a rental truck, looking defeated and lost. Part of me felt guilty, but a larger part felt satisfied that they'd finally experienced a fraction of what they'd put me through. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd moved in with my sister's former dance instructor, sleeping on couches and looking for work. Dad eventually found a part-time job at a hardware store, and Mom started cleaning houses. My sister got hired as a substitute teacher, barely making enough to contribute to their shared expenses. Update 2. 6 months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my sister, written on notebook paper in her careful handwriting. She didn't ask for money or help. Instead, she apologized for everything that had happened and acknowledged that what they'd done to me was unforgivable. She explained that living with the consequences of their choices had opened their eyes to how wrong they'd been. She'd started therapy and was working through her own guilt about being the favored child. She understood if I never wanted to see any of them again, but she wanted me to know that she was sorry. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for weeks. I'd read it occasionally, feeling conflicted about everything that had happened. The revenge had been satisfying, but it hadn't healed the wounds they'd left behind. Update 3. A year after the eviction, I made a decision that surprised even me. I reached out to my sister and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. Not our parents, just her. We met at the same place where this whole situation had started. She looked different, more mature somehow, with the kind of wisdom that comes from genuine hardship rather than manufactured drama. We talked for hours about our childhood, our parents' choices, and the different ways we'd both been damaged by their favoritism. She told me that our parents had finally found stable jobs and were renting a small apartment together. They'd stopped asking her to contact me on their behalf and seemed to understand that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. She wasn't asking me to forgive them or reconcile. She just wanted me to know they'd learned from what happened. I told her about the therapy I'd started, how I was working through my own anger and abandonment issues. The revenge had felt good in the moment, but it hadn't actually fixed anything inside me. I was trying to find healthier ways to process what had happened. We agreed to stay in limited contact, meeting occasionally for coffee or lunch. It wasn't the sibling relationship we might have had under different circumstances, but it was something. She was working to build her own life separate from our parents' influence, and I respected that effort. As for my parents, I haven't spoken to them since that day in the apartment. I don't know if I ever will. The 12-year-old boy inside me still wants their love and approval, but the adult I've become understands that some people aren't capable of giving what you need, even when they're supposed to be family. The Hendersons invited me to their anniversary party last month. Sitting at their table, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love me without conditions, I realized I'd already found my real family. Sometimes the people who matter most aren't the ones who share your DNA. They're the ones who show up when you need them and stay even when it's difficult. I gave my parents exactly what they deserved, but more importantly, I gave myself permission to stop waiting for them to become the people I needed them to be. That was the real victory.